I do think it's entirely possible that soldiers or engineers could be sent to Russia in exchange for help and perhaps for money that North Korea desperately needs. They have a history of that type of a relationship. The North Koreans are always pretending, or at least posing, as though they're preparing for war. You see this, for me, I used to see this on the ground, all these preparations, and there was something almost theatrical in nature about the preparations for war. And yet, I think that experts who watch this closely are seeing some language in there that really alarms them.
This is a conversation with Jean H. Lee. In 2011, Jean became the first American journalist to be granted access as a reporter in North Korea, and she then spent several years reporting from the country. As such, she has more first-hand experience with life in North Korea and with the North Korean state than almost anyone else in the West. And today, she's a fellow at the East-West Center, researching North Korean politics and foreign policy. In this conversation, we talked about the growing alliance between North Korea and Russia, whether North Korean troops will join the war in Ukraine, whether North Korea is preparing for war, and how China looks at all of this. If you like what I do and you want to support it, do consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, if you don't mind, I'd like to start on the latest big thing that was making headlines when it comes to North Korea, which is the visit of Russian President Putin to North Korea, and also the topic of the two countries growing closer and forging some kind of a alliance or a closer bond. And if we look at both of that, both Putin's visits to North Korea and this process of alliance forging, if I can call it that way, between the two countries, what is your take on that? How do you see this relationship and this development, and what is driving it in your view?
Yeah, this was a remarkable visit. I mean, it was notable for a couple of reasons. One is that North Korea has been so closed for the past 4 or 5 years since the pandemic, and since the breakdown of the nuclear negotiations with the United States. So Putin's visit was important for North Korea. It was important for Kim Jong-un because they've been so closed off, and I think very alarming for neighbors in the region. Because as Kim Jong-un emerges from isolation, it's clear that he's thinking very strategically about who he wants to build a relationship with. And his decision to strengthen the relationship with Russia obviously has larger implications. It's interesting for me because during my time in North Korea, the relationship between North Korea and Russia had really fallen by the wayside. Russia didn't seem that interested in North Korea. They were traditional allies. The Soviet Union was North Korea's first supporter when the modern republic was created. But while I was there, it was really just a traditional relationship. But I think that what changed, one of the big things that changed, of course, was that Russia launched the war on Ukraine and suddenly had a need for something that North Korea has, and that is stockpiles of ammunition and some ballistic missile technology. And so I do think that this was a moment for both Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un to reassess how much they need each other at a time when they don't have many friends, what that would say to the United States and to other countries and the threat that that would pose, and also what kind of transactional relationship and agreement they could forge that would help both of them. So, of course, we've heard White House officials say that North Korea has supplied millions of rounds to Russia for their use in Ukraine. Russia and North Korea denies it. This would be a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And then, of course, the question is, North Korea doesn't do anything for free. So what are they getting in return? With that with Putin's visit and the signing of some sort of a military pact, we don't know the details. And I think that that's what we're very concerned about, is what kind of agreement is this? What kind of agreement have they made in exchange for supporting one another? And I'm very concerned not only about how this may prolong the war in Ukraine, but also what North Korea might be getting in return that might help them accelerate the building of their nuclear program. And then, of course, the other part of it is that this strengthened relationship is going to make it very difficult to bring North Korea back into the international fold and to negotiate any kind of disarmament or denuclearization, because they've taken a stand and they now have Russia protecting them.
Would you say that this relationship is, from the perspectives of the two parties, purely transactional, and it's really about you give me ammunition, I give you money and technology, or do you think there's something more in it as well?
I do think the relationship is largely transactional, because I do think that North Korea tends to look at everything transactionally. They have very little, they have very few assets, and so they know how to use them, or they try to use them very strategically. They don't give up much. However, it's far more than that. So there are a couple things. I think for both of these leaders, at a time when they are very isolated, there's the propaganda element. So it's not just the transactional relationship. There's the propaganda element that that visit was over the top. I've seen in North Korea, I've been there on the ground for major events, but I've never seen a state visit like that. And certainly would have been great to feed the ego of Vladimir Putin, for him to show his people, look, we still have friends, even though it's just North Korea. On the other hand, I would say for Kim Jong-un as well, it's a way for him to show his people at a time when they've been so isolated, look, we still have friends. Our traditional allies have not abandoned us. Not only do we still have friends, but look, the leader, one of the great, from the North Korean perspective, one of the leaders of one of the great powers in the world, is coming all the way from Moscow to Pyongyang with a huge entourage. So there's that propaganda element that helps both of those leaders at a time when the people in both their countries are feeling isolated and wondering where this puts them in the world. There's also the messaging. For them to have this type of a high-profile summit state visit and strengthen the relationship, they know that it is going to spark alarm in the neighboring capitals, and that's precisely what they want to do as well. North Korea has signed on to Vladimir Putin and Russia's decision to stand up to the liberal world order that the United States and Japan and other countries are trying to maintain. So this is one more step in that standoff with the West that they know will be a challenge to the effort to prevent a kind of divide that we're seeing between Russia and its allies and the United States and its allies. It feels a little bit more like we're moving toward what feels to me like the Cold War. And they know that these moments where they stand together with great pomp and circumstance project that message and project that concern.
You've mentioned the mutual defense agreement that the two countries signed, and you've mentioned that we don't know exactly what's in it. But do we have any indications of what it might be about? Because perhaps if it was purely about exchanging ammunition and money, it might not need a big deal agreement like that. Is there a chance that it contains perhaps some clauses about mutual assistance if one of the two countries is attacked, that it could be some sort of a mutual defense treaty?
Exactly. I do think that we're looking at it as a mutual defense treaty, and that they've agreed to help one another come to support one another in the case of conflict and to defend one another in the case of conflict. This type of defense treaty existed between the Soviet Union and North Korea, but really fell apart when the Soviet Union fell apart, and Russia made some strategic decisions and established diplomatic relations with South Korea. So perhaps it's an agreement that existed previously and that it has been resuscitated to some degree. So it's not necessarily new. But I think that is the concern, is how are they going to characterize what a conflict is and when they might protect one another? And what does that mean in this era of nuclear weapons? Does that mean that they're going to come to each other's help with much bigger and much more dangerous weapons than they had back during the Soviet era? Those are all questions, I think, and concerns that we have about what this mutual defense pact means. I think there's another question as well, just more, not just theoretical, but very practically, about the Ukraine conflict in particular. So we already have these allegations about ammunition. We have experts who are saying that missiles that landed in Ukraine clearly have North Korean, that were made by the North Koreans. And then we have the question of, those are sanctions violations. And then now there's the question of, will North Korea be willing to send its soldiers to Ukraine to support Russia as part of this defense pact, right? Does this qualify as an occasion for them to call on each other's forces? That too would be a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And so these are the questions and concerns, I think, that are circulating in the capitals in the region.
Well, it's good that you've mentioned that, because there were allegations that there might be already, or that soon, North Korea might send a regiment of its military engineers to Ukraine to perhaps take part in rebuilding some of the, or maybe fortificating some of the occupied areas in Ukraine. And I think that so far it hasn't been confirmed. Probably even if it were true, it wouldn't be confirmed. But how likely do you think that this will happen, and that perhaps it would even move from sending North Korean engineers to sending North Korean troops to take part in the Ukraine war? Because I can imagine that from the Russian perspective, this would be a very welcome step, since it wouldn't have to expense its own people to die in the war if it could use someone else's. But would it make sense from the North Korean perspective?
So it's terrible to think that they would hire mercenaries like that, but that's what they could be and would be. And I don't think it's entirely impossible for that to happen. The Russians, so just to explain the background, the UN Security Council resolutions from 2017 asked UN member nations to send all of their North Korean workers home by December 2019. So they gave them 2 years. And that was part of the effort to stop the flow of money into North Korea's nuclear program. Because, and I talk about this a lot in my podcast, The Lazarus Heist, we talk about how North Koreans working abroad help to prop up the North Korean leadership, but also help to raise money for the nuclear program. So it's part of a long history of what we call illicit financing, and sanctions have tried over the decades to stop that flow of money. North Korean workers, we call them overseas workers, have been a huge source of hard currency for North Korea for many years. I focus in my podcast on the young hackers who are abroad to raise money. In Russia, for many, many years, you had loggers in the Vladivostok region who were dispatched to work and raise money. And these North Korean workers live under very constrained circumstances and have to hand over a good chunk of that money to the regime. And that's the question. That's why there's the attempt to stop that flow of money. Now, many countries did send the North Koreans back by the December 2019 deadline, but many simply did not get back. There's the belief and the understanding that many remained in China and Russia. Of course, a couple weeks after that deadline, North Korea, about a month after the deadline, North Korea sealed its borders at the start of the COVID pandemic in January 2020. So for 4 years before they reopened the borders, you had North Korean workers working illegally in countries, including Russia, most likely not only loggers, but possibly also hackers. So this has been an important source of income for the North Koreans. And I think the North Koreans have served as an important source of labor for Russia, especially in the Far East. So it's not super far-fetched to think that they could extend that violation of UN Security Council resolutions into the military sphere. But that would be such a provocative step. And I think that the collateral damage that we're looking at is, if that's the case and this mutual defense pact is actively helping not only North Korea's nuclear program, but also the conflict in Ukraine, South Korea may consider getting more actively involved, because that exchange is something that directly impacts Northeast Asia. So there are some consequences that we're looking at right now. What kinds of decisions are other countries in the region going to make if they believe that North Korea and Russia and that relationship is going to help advance the nuclear program and the threat in Northeast Asia, but also prolong the war in Ukraine? So it's really, but I do think it's entirely possible that soldiers or engineers could be sent to Russia in exchange for help and perhaps for money that North Korea desperately needs. They have a history of that type of a relationship. And I should make one more point, which is that I keep mentioning that these are violations of UN Security Council resolutions. For years, there's been a panel of experts. So these are investigators who are tasked with, with investigating sanctions violations, violations of those North Korean sanctions. But North Korea now has the protection of Russia, which vetoed their mandate and essentially forced the panel of experts, of investigators, to disband. So it means that we no longer have that oversight and that scrutiny of sanctions violations that we've had in the past. And that gives countries that are violating those sanctions and helping North Korea, gives them a bit more cover. So we're seeing all these steps that Russia and North Korea, perhaps that was at North Korea's request. We're seeing these North Korea and Russia working together on multiple fronts to enable this relationship and to allow them to work together without being caught, so to speak.
And I guess, and you've sort of hinted at it, the tools that the West has at its disposal to dissuade North Korea from moving in this direction, I assume, are kind of limited, since both North Korea and Russia are already extremely sanctioned. So it's quite unlikely that further sanctions might help, if so far it didn't really happen. Is there something that you think are perhaps tools or policies that are not being used and that we should deploy to try to sever this relationship?
That's absolutely right. That right now North Korea has the protection of both Russia and China at the UN Security Council resolution. So it's very hard for the UN Security Council to take any action at all. I'm sure China has a red line. We don't know exactly what it is. I think that we've seen in the past that China has had its limits, and North Korea is probably trying to get right up to that limit. It does mean that the United States, for example, has been focusing on its bilateral sanctions, so U.S. Treasury sanctions, to try to do what it can to try to stop the flow of money. And the focus has been on targeting the illicit financing of today, which is cyber theft. This is an area, this is what I focus on in my podcast because, I'm not particularly, I don't have a cyber background, but I chase the money. So when it comes to the North Koreans, if you're looking at the nuclear program and you're looking at how they're funding it, you have to chase the money. And for years, I've been looking at the possibility, the likelihood that they are using cyber theft as a way to get around the sanctions and also to get around those border closures. And so I think that this is a strategy that has been a long time in the making by Kim Jong-un, who is a millennial, who was educated in Switzerland, was seeing how the world was using computers, and was thinking, how do I take advantage of this? His country may be isolated, but in many ways he is not. He still has access to the outside world through the internet that he does not allow for many of his people, but he has access. So I do think that my belief and my feeling is that he's created this strategy to give him some space and provide a stream of funding, even as sanctions were tightening. So I think that we've been a little slow. I should say we in the policy world have been a little slow at chasing this and trying to make up for that. But I had a lot of information from the FBI at my disposal because they have been chasing these North Korean hackers for the past decade at least. The cyber attacks began even earlier. The attacks started on South Korea. So the hackers have really taken advantage of the evolution in all the technology, moving not only from cyber theft and phishing attempts, then ransomware, and then into cryptocurrency. And so what I do see from the US government is at least the effort to try to chase and tackle and try to stop that form of illicit financing. It is decades of a cat and mouse game when it comes to North Korean illicit financing and dodging sanctions. So it's nothing new. And it's fascinating to see all the different ways that the FBI and the North Koreans have played this cat and mouse game. The North Koreans are extremely innovative and they're very clever, very smart, and always finding ways to get around the sanctions, and cyber and crypto are the newest form of what used to be smuggling luxury goods, making counterfeit US dollars, and producing methamphetamine. So now what they're doing, a lot easier just to steal it through crypto, I think. So that's what we're seeing. So people will say that they're not doing anything. I do see that they're doing what they can in that chase to try to at least stop the flow of money or slow the flow of money at a time when the North Koreans aren't speaking to the United States. And when you think about it, if you can at least try to slow the funding into the program, that's the least that you can do at this point.
And does that ever seem to actually work to convince North Koreans to behave differently? Because
sanctions?
Yes, sanctions, or trying to restrict their illicit sources of funding. Because I can imagine that if it might be the only thing you can do if they're not talking to you, but does it actually work?
So does it convince them to change their behavior? Perhaps not in the positive sense. But it does perhaps convince them to change their tactics. And that's why I call it a cat and mouse game. So the sanctions will just compel them to keep running and finding new ways around the sanctions. But I wouldn't, we have to also recognize that there's a calculation, because there is a lot of collateral damage with sanctions as well, because those sanctions that do aim to stop the flow of money, including restricting how much North Koreans can sell, as I mentioned, sending workers abroad. There are some consequences to that too, which is they cut off a lot of people from a source of income, and they It prevents North Koreans from getting out and seeing the world. And that means that also it makes it harder for them, for those people who were a conduit of information, to take information back to North Korea and to learn how the world is, how people outside their country live and think. So, and of course, at the end of the day, it's always the people of North Korea who suffer the most, while a small percentage of the elites thrive. And so there is that kind of consequence. In terms of, does it change behavior? One thing I'm looking at right now is, how have the sanctions affected North Korea's foreign policy and how it operates in the world? In my podcast, I do go into a lot of detail about how the North Koreans used their embassies and their presence abroad to create a network and to reach out to middlemen to carry out some of the money laundering and smuggling and to aid that illicit financing campaign. People will say, critics will sometimes say, sanctions don't work. I think that's a very complicated question, and sanctions always deserve to be looked at and considered very carefully with all the good and bad that they can effect. But just looking at the overseas network, one thing I will note is that North Korea within the last year, perhaps even within the last year, has closed at least 9 embassies abroad. In a real shift, and it's a huge number for a small country like North Korea, which has a small presence abroad. So I do think it's worth considering whether the sanctions have forced the North Koreans to rethink how they use their embassies, has made those embassies less viable as a conduit or a way station for illicit financing and smuggling. And so that's something that I'm looking at as well. Have the sanctions reshaped how they think about their presence overseas? Has that affected their ability to smuggle and establish some of those nefarious networks abroad? Does it also mean that they're relying more heavily on cyber theft because they don't need the manpower abroad to help with that overseas network? And that, again, also means that we have less access to North Koreans because there are fewer of them out in the world. And I do think sometimes the more North Koreans you have out in the world, the better those diplomats' understanding is of how the world works, the more opportunity they have for interaction, and they can take that experience back to Pyongyang. So there's a consequence to that shutdown in their overseas presence as well.
I think when we're talking about how to dissuade North Koreans from doing one thing or another, I guess I've always thought that if someone can change what they're doing or how they're behaving, it could be China. And I think it would be interesting to talk about that, because I'd be curious to know if, in your opinion, how does China view what North Korea has been doing? Growing a closer relationship with Russia, possibly sending troops to Ukraine, escalating the situation in the region. How do you think China is looking at all of this? And how is actually the North Korean relationship with China today? Since I've always seen China as the main partner, if you can call it that way, or the main actor with the most influence on how North Korea operates. Is that still true?
All these relationships are very complicated. They're so much more complicated than they may appear at face value. So, and that includes the Russia-North Korea relationship and the China-North Korea relationship. I think it's always helpful to remember that Korea has this phrase, shrimp among whales. And so shrimp among whales, the actual proverb is something like, when the whales play, it's the shrimp whose back breaks. So Korea has always seen itself as this tiny little country sandwiched among these great powers, and has always seen its survival as being dependent on its ability to navigate these big relationships and figuring out how to wedge itself in so that it doesn't disappear. So I always find that very helpful when I try to understand the Korean point of view. Uh, when it comes to China, they have thousands of years of a relationship where Korea, as a tiny, tiny country, was always subject to invasion by the outside forces, including from the region, and having to strategically pay homage to whoever was in power in China. So this is a relationship that predates modern Korea. It goes back for thousands of years. In the modern era, China has been North Korea's main lifeline and willing to step in and kind of like play a big brother role. The big brother role is a role that China wants to play in the region with all the countries, to be honest. And it's a very, as you can imagine, it's a very patronizing relationship. And the North Koreans many of the North Koreans I spoke to when I was in Pyongyang resented the reliance on China. They resented the patronizing relationship. So that's why I say it's a little bit complicated. It's not an easy relationship, even for the North Koreans. I think the Chinese have always seen Korea, or North Korea in particular, as playing a very specific role, which is to serve as a kind of buffer, especially when they've got U.S. troops in the region. And so they also share a very long border with North Korea. And so what they want is to at least maintain a certain level of stability along that border, and to support North Korea enough so that they don't have a complete disaster right on their border. And I think that that's a complicated question for China when it comes to the nuclear program. Because while they want to protect and support North Korea to a certain degree, I think the Chinese have huge concerns about the danger posed by the nuclear program, including nuclear safety issues right on their border, especially when it comes to nuclear tests. So I think for China, it's a really complicated relationship because they want to support North Korea to a certain degree, and they want to have leverage, and they want to have access. And those are things that North Korea plays sort of leverages very well, but they don't want to enable North Korea too much so that they pose a threat to China. So I think it's a complicated relationship. I think the leadership in Beijing is probably a little bit wary of, even though they are supportive of Russia on many things, probably a little bit wary about what's happening between North Korea and Russia and what that relationship could do to make this situation in the region a little bit more unstable. So I think that it's important to recognize that all these relationships are very complicated, that it's not just as easy as saying China can do this or China should do that. We should lean on China. Governments should lean on China to do what they can, but recognize that there's also a limit to what the North Koreans will accept and how much they will listen to China. So it's a complicated relationship. But they obviously have the capability, as the lifeline, as the country that really was the first to resume trade and to come to North Korea's support after North Korea emerged from isolation. So obviously that's a tap that they can turn on and turn off, and that's the leverage that they have. In exchange, they're looking for leverage. They're looking for access in North Korea, and North Korea will turn on and turn off that tap as well. So it's not as simple as it may look to some former U.S. presidents.
And do you think that China might see this as sort of Russia stepping into its backyard when it's growing closer with North Korea?
I mean, I think outwardly it suits the sorry,
It's all
loud
right.
trucks. Outwardly, it suits this mission to kind of stand up to the United States. But I think I do also think that China and Russia have other interests that they need to be mindful of, because, and they have different objectives. I think China and Russia have very different objectives in what they're trying to do right now. China wants to use the opportunity to exert influence globally. I don't think Russia, Vladimir Putin, is so interested in that. He has very different objectives. So I think that, and then also I do think that they are both mindful of their relationship with South Korea and other countries in the region. So that's why I will say it's so much more complicated, and there are ways that they're going to share certain elements of those relationships and keep other elements close to their chest because they have other stakeholders to consider. The question of whether China feels so outwardly, yes, I think that they're going to support the strengthening of these relationships, but perhaps behind closed doors, they're concerned about the specifics of that military alliance and that pact, just like so many other capitals are as well.
So another thing that I wanted to talk about is this a whirl of news that started to appear in mainstream media since a couple months ago that are basically talking about how North Korea is allegedly preparing for war. And they're citing different experts and different theories and different reasons why that might be the case. But I wanted to hear your opinion. I assume that you've seen this and you know what I'm talking about. And I'd like to hear what's your view on this. Where is this idea coming from? And whether it might hold any water, whether there might be something to it, or do you think that's completely out of the question at this point?
The North Koreans are always pretending, or at least posing, as though they're preparing for war. You see this, for me, I used to see this on the ground, all these preparations, and there was something almost theatrical in nature about the preparations for war. That said, you always have to take seriously these preparations, because even though so much of it is very theatrical, they are also in reality improving their capability. So what I would say is that there's a lot of rhetoric right now and a lot of propaganda coming from North Korea that with the goal of creating the impression that we're on the verge of war on the Korean Peninsula, and they do this cyclically. There's a particular reason now. I think this is part of their part of North Korea's reemergence and preparation for what awaits them, depending on who's in the White House. I can explain a little bit more about that in a bit. But I would say that anyone advocating for or suggesting that that we're about to have a conflict on the Korean Peninsula is watching North Korean state media very closely and also doing exactly what the North Koreans want, which is to raise the alarm bells. So I think that those kinds of headlines those are the kinds of headlines that media outlets love to publish, because they create anxiety. You're going to click on that, right? Are we about to see another conflict? And so you have to take them with a grain of salt. And yet I think that experts who watch this closely are seeing some language in there that really alarms them. And so they're trying to raise the alarm that we can't ignore North Korea's buildup and their threats, even though I think we've had so many tests and so many threats that it can be a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. It can, especially if you're in Korea, South Korea, you are living with this threat. So the South Koreans don't always pay attention. So really for these experts, it's just it was a timely reminder, I think, and an opportunity to raise that alarm. That said, I think that's precisely what the North Koreans want, is for us to say that we're on the verge of war on the Korean Peninsula. We are always on the verge of war, to be absolutely honest, because the Korean War was never resolved. So it's a good reminder as well that here in America, we call it the Forgotten War. But it is a conflict that was never resolved because they signed an armistice in 1953 and not a peace treaty. And so that is a fact that the North Koreans take advantage of. And they use the fact that there was no peace treaty as a rationale or an opportunity to keep the country in war mode. So when you're in Pyongyang, it's always war mode. They're always preparing for war. And just like the South Koreans kind of accept the threat and go about their daily lives, I would say the North Koreans also are so accustomed to the preparations for war that it just becomes something that goes in one ear and out the other. So, yeah, I think the specific language, we did see a shift in particular when it comes to how North Korea looks at South Korea. And that was what caused some alarm. And that was very deliberate as well. It was certainly designed to create some concern in Seoul and to serve as a kind of disinformation campaign against the current South Korean president, who's very conservative, and to punish the South Koreans for standing with the United States. And along those lines, while I might not say that we're going to see war breakout, because I think the North Koreans know that would be somewhat suicidal. I think we will see provocations, and we have seen provocations. We will see the North Koreans really trying to provoke the South Koreans and bring them to the edge of war. And I say that it's all part of a longer-term strategy to raise tensions in the region, because the more you can provoke South Korea, the United States, maybe even Japan, the more justification Kim Jong-un has to pour money into the nuclear program and say, look, we're under threat and I need to defend you. So it all fits into a larger strategy. That said, any test right now, any provocation is so dangerous. And so that threat of conflict is always there. So those are all, I wouldn't say that these are empty concerns at all. They're very real concerns that we should be aware of all the time. Whether we're seeing North Korea prepare for an invasion, I don't know, because I feel that those are at this point threats, and hopefully will remain threats and not something that they will take action on like we saw in 1950. What we've seen in the last couple months is kind of like a very, I would say, childish form of retaliation, which is North Korea sending these massive balloons filled with garbage across the border. So this is a country that has very sophisticated weapons, and yet that is how they were trying to provoke South Korea. And that, I would say, is kind of meant to cause disruption and emotional harm, if not any kind of real threat. So, we're going to see little provocations like this, I think, for the time being. And I think part of that is to create anger in South Korea against the South Korean president. And we're seeing that right now. There's an online petition with signatures calling for his impeachment. So trying to create a sense of a threat and unease in South Korea to work against the South Korean president. And I would say for North Korea, it's a way to position itself and get North Korea on the radar at a time when they recognize that there may be a new president or a second Biden term in the White House. So part of this is also preparing for who it is they're going to be dealing with, if they deal with them at all.
I think I want to talk about the relationship with the US, but just before we get to that, on the note of sort of analyzing what North Korea wants to do or not from the position of experts like you. I've always been sort of wondering to what extent or how difficult it is to analyze the politics of a country that is so notoriously isolated. And when I imagine the only information that you have are from the North Korean official sources, which is obviously filled with pure propaganda. And I think we can probably run into this issue in other countries as well, to an extent in China as well. But in North Korean case, I can imagine that it's quite extreme, and it must make work of people like you quite difficult. And I think maybe to add to that, I think you are in quite a unique situation, since you actually do have a lot of firsthand experiences from when you were a journalist in North Korea. So you know what it's like to watch what's happening inside of the country and then outside of it. And I would also wonder to what extent, if you actually know a lot more if you're inside of the country, because I imagine that even then you're very tightly controlled of what you can do, who you can talk to, what you can find out.
Those are great questions, and I think it's so smart of you to think about that, because I put out a blog post when I was with the Wilson Center right after the border closures to say that this is not just about the COVID-19 virus, right? But this is also an opportunity that North Korea is taking advantage of to control the flow of information. And I remember at the time, people thought I was being exceptionally harsh. But for me, my perspective is based so much on my time in North Korea and understanding how their society works from the inside. And I honestly cannot even imagine doing my job as a journalist or as an analyst, if I didn't have that time on the ground. In some ways, it's very easy to analyze North Korea from the outside if you just assume that you're never going to have contact with the North Koreans or never have access, because then you have no accountability. I think that both journalists and analysts who only look at it from the outside can kind of cut themselves a little slack and say, well, I can never try to reach them and they're never going to speak to me anyway. In some ways, it's more complicated when you do make the effort to try to speak to them or contact them, because the more experience you have with North Korea on the ground and with North Koreans, the more complicated you realize it is. So when you're looking at it from afar, it's very easy to see it as black and white, and that makes your job easy in some ways. The more contact you have and the more exposure you have, the more complicated, the more difficult it becomes. And you realize that it's not black and white, that it's extremely, it's not a monolithic country. The people don't all think exactly the way they're presented in state media. And that every single North Korean has a complicated emotional and intellectual challenge that they have to grapple with every day. And so it's very hard when you deal with them directly to demonize them the way that you can when you only look at them from the outside. So part of the reason, though, that the North Koreans, I think, wanted to seal the border, and, to my point about that being an opportunity, is to control the flow of information, not only coming in from the outside to the North Koreans, but also to limit our access to information. And it gave them an opportunity to really reshape the narrative and the messaging, both to their people, especially after the breakdown in negotiations between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, but also to create like this fog of war so that it's harder for us on the outside to really understand what's happening. And it is painful for me. Sometimes I see people I can tell when somebody is just reading the propaganda and assumes that that's all they have, right? Or that's all they have consulted, because it makes it very hard to really get to the truth of what the North Koreans want and how they operate.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.